and welcome to Site 81 Center for Cultural Memetics and Literary Mnestics. I'm Dr. Rains, and I'll be your head researcher for today's project. Let's begin.
The you and me in SCP. The you and me in SCP. The you and me in SCP. How fandom transforms canon.
The interaction between creators, their content, and their fan bases are some of the most nuanced dynamics within popular culture. Within the last 30 years, these relationships have shifted from largely one-sided to what many would call symbiotic. Pre-internet interactions between fans and creators were largely limited to the purchasing of media by fans. But within the development of online fan culture and the accessibility it has granted, fan and creator interactions are now centered around facilitating open conversations about media itself. Many creators have actively embraced this cultural connectivity by engaging with fandom work and fan content. J.K. Rowling and Andrew Hussie are two examples of authors who are very present within their respective fandoms, the latter of who incorporates elements of his fandom back into his work. While these relationships are mutually beneficial, a fandom's ability to interact with its media canon is still limited by the exclusive nature of canon itself. This exclusivity has kept fan and creator dynamics from reaching true symbiosis. The SCP Fandom is an immersive collaborative writing community centered around a fictional organization called the SCP Foundation. The focus of this fictional foundation is the accumulation, classification, and preservation of different anomalous artifacts through the creation of containment logs. The format of these logs, as well as the overall format of the SCP Fandom, uniquely challenge the conventions of fan creation and fan engagement. By blending the concepts of creator, content, and fan base, this community has unintentionally redefined fan literary terminology in a way that no fandom really has before. Through the exploration of this fan terminology and the continued development of the SCP Fandom, we will seek to see how a community and platform can serve to elevate canon.
What is canon?
An imperative distinction to be made is the difference between academic literary terminology and fan literary terminology. While both concepts relate to the theoretical language around literary analysis, that language is often quite different. This has to do with the adaptive nature inherent to both language and the internet. An important term shared by both communities is the idea of narrative canon. Like many of our modern literary conventions, the meaning of this word has evolved several times over the last 1,000 years. Literary theorist Dean Kolbs helps conceptualize the etymology of this term in his book Critical Theory and Literary Canon. Kolbs cites Greek sculptor Polykaletos as one of the first to adopt the term canon to a similar connotation to the modern term canon today. In terms of fan literature, canon refers to the official chronology of a piece of media. More specifically, it's the confirmed truth of fact untainted by opinion, theory, or conjecture.
As codified by Plato, excellence, beauty, justice, and goodness were each form of the idea of truth, which ideally had to be comprehended by anyone who would be genuinely knowing and just.
Understanding the importance of truth within canon helps us conceptualize of its definition, but ultimately, we're still left with the question of how that truth is determined. In the contemporary world of media analysis, there are two main philosophies when it comes to assessing the canonical boundaries of a piece of media. The first approach is to posit truth in the hands of a content creator. This approach has widely been adopted by the Homestuck fandom. Andrew Hussie, the author of Homestuck, is intrinsically entwined with the story itself. The narrative is his, and as such, his intentions and interpretations set the base of Homestuck's canon. Outside the comic itself, there is added value in understanding the perception Hussie has of his work. In a sense, in this view, canon is defined by authorial intent.
This intent of the text's author includes the values, objectives, interests, policy, aims, and function that the author sought to actualize. The subjective purpose reflects a true intent of the author at the time the text was created.
If an author says something is canon, then it's canon. No more need be said. The second approach stems from the literary concept of death of the author. This philosophy seeks to negate any power an author has on the comprehension of their work outside the walls of the media itself.
It designates exactly what linguists referring to Oxford philosophy call a performative, a rare verbal form in which the enunciation has no other content other than the act by which it is uttered.
In other words, if something's not blatantly written or said in the context of the content, then it can't be considered canon. Many Harry Potter fans have taken this view in regards to author J.K. Rowling. Through the years of her social media presence, Rowling has made several claims on the context of specific elements in her story. Many in the Harry Potter fandoms regard Rowling's claims as unsupported by the series or just blatantly problematic. Consequently, a lot of fans have separated author and canon, placing truth within the work itself. This distinction is necessary because many fandoms hold the concept of canon as sacred. Neither of these views are inherently more valid than the other, yet both views still exclude the role of fans from determining any canonical value.
But what is the role of fans?
Even before the rise of modern fandom culture, the relationship between fans and their media canon of choice have been fundamentally synergetic. A work needs a fan base to validate its existence, just as much as a fandom needs a work to bring about its own. Of course, I'm not saying that content creators can't produce content without an audience. I mean, just look at my channel. I've been producing content for years and I still don't have an audience. But when it comes to an author or artist's social success, both pop cultural and academic notoriety are predominantly determined by the widespread consumption of their content. I talk more about this idea in my Can Bad Art Be Good video, in which I explore the role of collective perception in determining value. I reiterate this dichotomy because it's easy to overlook the impact of fans and their relationship with media. They play a crucial role in the comprehension of canon, and though barred from direct literary control, fan literary culture has evolved to accommodate active fan narrative exploration. The phrase headcanon is a fan literary term that is rooted in the fan fiction livejournal communities of the late 2000s. By 2010, the term had been adopted by most fan-oriented platforms, and by 2012, the phrase had permanently cemented itself into the online vernacular. A headcanon refers to a fan's personal interpretation of a narrative work that is extrapolated or unsupported by its canon. Commonly referred to as a fan theory, headcanons can range from seemingly plausible to completely unfounded. In many cases, popular headcanons are held fandom-wide and regarded similarly to canonical fact, but no matter how popular or plausible a headcanon is, it fundamentally is not canon and can't be treated with the same legitimacy. Homestuck is one of many fandoms whose author actively encourages fan-theoretical engagement. Because Homestuck is a Bildungsroman that focuses on several intertwining coming-of-age narratives, the amount of conflicting interpretations for each character's developmental motivation is as big as the comic is long. There have been several times throughout Homestuck's long history where Hussie has taken a fan character or fan concept and made them canon. The most recent example of this would be the Juning of John Egbert. After reading the events in the Homestuck epilogue, several fans identified the characterization of Homestuck's protagonist John Egbert with the experiences of a pre-T trans woman. While not universally held, this headcanon found popularity amongst a lot of queer fans. Then came the Toblerone hunts of late 2019. After hiding several Toblerone around his city, Hussie promised to grant the request of the first person who could find one. On August 5th, Twitter user placeholder for Abin posted this photo of herself with a signed Toblerone.
Having proving myself conscientious and invested, I declare June Egbert real.
To this, Hussie responded,
"You were the first to find my treasure, and so it will be done."
Honestly, some fans have trouble perceiving this interaction as anything more than a playful joke. But when prescribing to our first approach to canon, this authorial approval illustrates the perceived value in canonical legitimacy. While this change might seem narratively inconsequential, this unheading of canon essentially reframes what was once speculative conjecture to ultimate fact. Alternatively, there is the fan literary concept of fanon. If headcanons are speculative fan assumptions barred from the legitimacy of canon, then fanon is the results of fans trying to reclaim some of that legitimacy. Much like the term headcanon, fanon's etymology stems from fanfiction culture. In its simplest form, fanon refers to the chronology of a fanfiction, separate from the original chronology of the canon media it's adapting. To help conceptualize this, let's use J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter as an example of a canon work. Within the text, it's stated that Harry is a wizard, so this can be considered a canonical fact. But let's say that I, as a fan, speculate that because Harry's a wizard, he must be related to Harry Houdini. Even though I have reasoning for this assumption, because it's not confirmed within the pages of the text, my speculation is just a headcanon. Now let's suppose I wrote a fanfiction where Harry meets the ghost of his dead grandfather, Harry Houdini. While my headcanon still isn't legitimized within the original text itself, the fan theory can be considered canon within the chronology of my fanfiction, the adapted universe in this fanfiction being fanon. Literary and fan literary theorist Karen Hellingston and Christina Bussey clearly define this dynamic in their book, Fan Fiction and Fan Communities in the Age of the Internet.
Canon is the events presented in the media source that provides a universe, setting, and characters, and fanon is the events created by the fan community in a particular fandom and repeated pervasively throughout the fan text.
While both the terms fan fiction and fan text allude to traditional adaptation, fanon can refer to the chronology of any adaptive medium. The common term used for these fanon works is an AU, or alternate universe. While these AUs are attempts to legitimize the impact of fan engagement, they are still unable to impact the strict division between fandom, creators, and content.
The SCP Fandom.
As said before, the SCP Foundation is an immersive, collaborative writing community primarily centered on the SCP site. The immersive element becomes quickly apparent when looking both at format and presentation of the Wikidot. Superficially, the SCP Wiki is built to resemble a real .gov website like the FBI or CIA. Before you can even enter, you're met with a warning.
Warning. The Foundation database is classified. Access by unauthorized personnel is strictly prohibited. Perpetrators will be tracked, located, and detained.
While likely a little jarring for anyone stumbling across the site at random, this warning sets up the overarching importance of suspending disbelief that is at the core of this community. This suspension is not only crucial to the context of the in-universe content, but to the operation of the fandom as a whole. There are two main ways to make content on the SCP Wiki. The first and most common type of on-site content are the SCP containment logs. Narratively, these are short articles documenting the description, object class, and special containment procedures of the many anomalous items housed by the Foundation. Each item, or SCP, has a numerical designation starting at SCP-001 and spanning several thousand articles. Functionally, these articles serve as different writing concepts posted by individual writers on the wiki. The scope of these concepts can range from celestial gods hell-bent on destroying humanity to a never-ending bag of potatoes. The second type of on-site content are the SCP tales. While SCP logs focus on specific items the Foundation has in containment, the tales focus more widely on the SCP universe itself. These stories often look at the dynamic interactions between different groups of interests, Foundation colleagues, and the anomalous concepts first developed in the containment logs. Much like the logs, anyone who has access to the wiki can write a tale, but unlike their more immersive counterparts, these stories aren't limited to the same structural format. As a result, the writing style of a tale can range anywhere from a monologue-style orientation to a prose-based narrative to something as free-formed as a grim, dark poem.
The seventh bride will break the tide. The moon no more will shine. There comes a day, not far away, shall birth the death of time.
As a writing community, this narrative freedom and accessibility serves to foster a creative and inclusive atmosphere. But as a collective writing project, this narrative accessibility poses a problem: continuity. As the SCP writing community first started to grow in popularity, one of the biggest concerns among writers was the stability of canon. With a growing number of SCP creators and no real system of regulating continuity, the efforts to enforce narrative consistency pose too big and disruptive of a task for any individual on-site staff. In addition, the early on-site culture was very turbulent, as many of the on-site administrators didn't value the same inclusivity and literary support that's built into the site today. Frederick Knudsen well documents the operations and many problems of the early wiki in his video series Down the Rabbit Hole.
If you are consistently stupid/horrible at writing, we do not want you. If your SCP keeps getting downvoted or deleted, maybe you should be doing something else. Instead of constantly cleaning up after bad users, remove the source of the issue.
Early personnel drama, like when ex-wiki member the Fishmonger harassed other users before pulling all of his work off-site, as well as these contentious literary values, made it impossible for any admin or on-site member to effectively monitor a cohesive canon. The solution they found for this problem was the adoption, or better put adaptation, of a loose canon. Loose canon refers to concepts or materials from a work of media whose chronology shouldn't be scrutinized. If canon relates to the importance of ultimate truth, then a loose canon relates to the acknowledgement of potential truth. There's a common misconception in the SCP fandom that the universe has no canon.
There is no canon. There can never be a canon. Why? Because the very nature of the site forbids it.
While this is an understandable assumption, this misframing of canon is actually detrimental, as it directly opposes the immersive core of the community. By asserting there is no canon, you're ostensibly saying that there is no value in engaging with this narrative content. A better way of framing this is to say that anything could be canon. This idea of the SCP universe's loose canon is elaborated on the Wiki Canon Hub page.
The idea that there is no canon is a bit silly at times. It's not that we don't have any, it's that we have a multitude which touch, cross, and dip into each other. It's up to you, as the reader, to decide what you believe and what you embrace as the heart of the universe.
The last part of this quote is crucial to understanding the SCP writing community as a whole. In essence, you as an individual choose to accept what does and doesn't fit into your own comprehension of canon. While the majority of SCP tales can be found on the Wiki Foundation's tale page, several of these tales can be found on the Canon Hub. The Canon Hub is a list of several different canonical departures from what is traditionally thought of as the SCP central storyline. Each canon, essentially its own AU, offers a general loose structure for writers to narratively contribute to or adapt. For example, the Broken Masquerade canon exists in a universe where the SCP Foundation was unable to keep secrecy. The Unfounded canon takes place in a universe where the SCP Foundation was never formed. While both of these alternative universes offer more narrative direction than the central SCP chronology, the validity of these canons are also ultimately subject to an individual's willingness to accept them. This individualistic approach to canon ultimately means a few things when attempting a modern narrative comprehension of SCP work. For writers, it loosens the pressure to be consistent when writing SCP content. Because of the community's immersive nature, the boundaries between author and content are often blurred. Many authors both write about and roleplay as original characters working for the Foundation. Mitchell Peters, another of the early Wikidot's on-site administration, often writes and roleplays as their persona, Dr. Jack Bright. As an admin and longtime contributor of SCP content, Peters' work has seen a rise in popularity through their time on the wiki. Because of this, Dr. Bright is one of the most infamous characters in the SCP universe. As a result, people are more inclined to include him in their stories. Normally, this would be tricky because Dr. Bright exists as a character, but also as a real person who works for the SCP Wiki. But because of the loose approach to canon, authors are able to write about any character, place, or event and have it fit within their own canonical framework. For readers, this approach to personalized canon means that fans can read an author's interpretation of these same concepts and actively choose to accept or exclude them in their own canonical perception. Rather than framing fan interpretations as less legitimate or a headcanon, the SCP's canon is almost entirely reliant on its audience's understanding of what is and isn't canonical. And while nothing is technically correct, the more widely held a fan understanding is, the more common it's accepted as canon. Works like Homestuck deal directly with the uncanonizing of chronology, as the authors or characters actively denounce the boundaries of their chronology.
In other words, there is an important distinction between events which can be considered to occur inside canon, outside canon, and those which are not canon at all.
Alternatively, the SCP community deals with the opening of chronology, in a sense, making canon accessible to anyone who will engage with the work. One of the most interesting implications of this is that even fanon work created outside of the wiki is, in a sense, canon.
The rise of off-site content.
Because of the adaptive nature intrinsic to SCP content, its open conceptualization of canon has led to the narrative exploration of off-site content. Put more simply, since anyone can produce SCP content, it shouldn't be relevant where they produce it. A popular example of off-site content is SCP Containment Breach, a free-to-play indie game developed by Jonas Hrikonen. As a first-person horror game, the story follows a Foundation D class as he tries to escape a dangerous containment breach. Much like the traditional tales of the wiki, this game serves to further develop the universe, politics, and personnel originally established in the SCP containment logs. Other projects like Secret Laboratory, Blackout, or the Foundation art books only continue to blend the content and fandom immersion central to this community. The biggest place for this off-site growth has arguably been the platform of YouTube. The culture and format of the SCP YouTube community have changed a lot over the last 8 years. In the early days, YouTube content mainly focused on direct engagement with established SCP media. This presented itself in two main ways. The first of this popular content were audio narrations of wiki.stories. These narrations were typically read verbatim from the many different on-site tales and containment logs. The second form of this early SCP-Tube content came about with the rise of gameplay commentary. In 2012, many of the newly formed Let's Play channels had a focus on horror-related content. While the tone of SCP writing can range anywhere from humorous to tragic, the popularity of indie horror adaptations like SCP Containment Breach caught the attention of these early YouTube Let's Players. A large part of the SCP fandom's growth, both on-site and on YouTube, are due to larger content creators like Markiplier or PewDiePie, signal-boosting games like SCP Containment Breach. Additionally, early roleplay SCP YouTube content also exhibited this thematic interest in horror. While immersive roleplay and live-action content existed, it did so in smaller quantities. The main point of note is much of this early YouTube content existed in tandem or as an extension of the SCP Wiki community. But as the community of SCP fans on YouTube started to grow, so too did the cultural separation between platforms. In the last 4 years, the SCP YouTube community has slowly shifted its focus onto producing original narrative content. Whereas before, the prominent genres were Let's Reads and Let's Plays, today, you're more likely to see an SCP cinematic movie or animated story. SCP Overlord is a live-action independent film produced by the YouTube channel Evan Royalty. Inspired by the works of H.P. Lovecraft and Junji Ito, this film is an original cinematic story centered around the Foundation's raid on an anomalous cult. Confinement is an ongoing animated web series by YouTuber Lord Bung. This series focuses on Connor, a humanoid SCP with the power to respawn after death. Each episode puts Connor in a different dangerous yet wacky scenario, while slowly developing an overarching plot. Both of these stories exist as fanon media in that they are both derivative of main site content, but because the SCP canon is determined by individual adaptive perception, the chronological legitimacy of both of these works is just as canon as any on-site tale. In addition to these original narrative SCP series, there's also an abundance of SCP animated explaining channels. YouTubers like SCP Explained, Story and Animation, SCP Animated Tales from the Foundation, and the succinctly named Dr. Bob document and connect the different logs and tales that make up the SCP universe. With the abundance of YouTube content, the SCP fandom has just started to push itself into mainstream fandom acknowledgement on the YouTube platform. Interestingly though, the growth of the SCP fandom on YouTube is largely independent from the SCP Wiki fandom. Because of the sheer amount of YouTube content, it's possible for many SCP fans to be heavily involved in the YouTube community while having never gone to the actual wiki itself. In these cases, fans base their perception of canon exclusively off of YouTube content. Uniquely, this sub-community of SCP fans serves as one of the only examples of a modern fandom that's fanbase can exist without ever having interacted with its source material. Because of cultural differences between the SCP fandom on the wiki and the SCP fandom on YouTube, there has been some occasional animosity between the two platforms. This animosity mainly stems from the perception of the YouTube fandom by some on-site fans. Because of the SCP community's roots in horror-related content, there is a subsection of younger fans who have active ties to the creepypasta community. Because YouTube prioritizes engagement, there's a lot of YouTube-specific content that caters to the vocal minority of younger fans. The abundance of this juvenile content has led some on-site fans to worry about the integrity of the fandom as a whole. Additionally, within the past year, there has been a vocal discourse between the early SCP YouTube content creators and the newer animated content creators. On March 3rd, 2021, the YouTube channel SCP Illustrated uploaded his now-deleted video entitled The SCP Animation Problem, in which he explained how the YouTube algorithm only promoted animated SCP content. He was clearly emotional in his video, as he reflected on how many of the hard-working SCP content creators have been continuously overshadowed by quick turnaround animation companies like the Infographics Show or the Histographics channel. Despite the forlorn felt by older fandom members, neither the older YouTube content creators nor the on-site fans can ignore the power of this growing YouTube community. SCP Illustrated ended his video by reiterating the inevitability of YouTube shifting interest into this new cultural format. One interesting outcome of this communal bifurcation has been the separate conceptualizations of canon. While prominent perception and individualistic impression are still the determining factors in both communities, the popularity and interpretation of people's headcanons have evolved separately on each platform. One example of this is the Foundation's Ethics Committee, a group in charge of regulating the ethics behind the Foundation's containment procedures. In the early days of the wiki, the Foundation was often depicted as a necessary evil. In turn, the Foundation's Ethics Committee was often seen as an oxymoronic joke, usually getting in the way of Foundation researchers.
How many members of the Ethics Committee does it take to change a light bulb? None. The Ethics Committee can't change anything.
In October of 2011, a wiki writer called Researcher Vogt wrote a very influential article called The Ethics Committee Orientation, in which he reframes the Ethics Committee as the cutthroat secret backbone of the Foundation.
The Foundation is not evil. We don't torture people just because. We are against unnecessary cruelty. Which means somebody has to decide when cruelty is necessary. And that somebody is us. Stop trembling.
This perception of the Ethics Committee was the predominant headcanon when the early YouTube SCP community was forming. But in the recent years of the YouTube fandom, the Ethics Committee, like many other aspects of the modern Foundation, have garnered a more sympathetic view. Essentially, the prominent perception of this committee likens it to the Foundation's Human Resources Department. YouTuber and writer Dr. Cimmerian documents this changing perception in his video, You're Wrong About the Ethics Committee. He says, unlike the grittier perception on the wiki, this newer conceptualization posits that
the Ethics Committee is very committed to ethical treatment, the ethical treatment of anomalies.
This softer interpretation of the Foundation can also be seen in the narrative depiction of D-Class personnel. D-Class, or Disposable Class, are the titles given to the test subjects that the Foundation uses when interacting, exploring, or testing different anomalies. A widely held belief is that D-Class are usually death row inmates, but since there's no set canon, a far less popular concept is that the Foundation kidnaps homeless people or anyone who won't be missed. For the longest time, the popular canonical take was that the Foundation would promise D-Class freedom after a month of service. Then, at the end of the month, D-Class personnel would be executed and a new batch would take their place. Towards the beginning of the SCP YouTube community, this was the prominent view of many SCP creators, but as the YouTube community started to grow, many incoming fans mistakenly took the Foundation's false promises of freedom as legitimate. Consequently, a lot of these new fans' understanding of the SCP canon was that D-Class personnel were released at the end of the month. Because canon is determined by individualistic perception, this conceptualization, while not as widely believed, is still just as valid. Due to the communal nature of this individualistic view of canon, the independent evolution of canonical perception on YouTube has worked its way back into the perception of canon on the main site. As newer fans enter the fandom through exposure to the YouTube community, the more their ideas shape the way the SCP universe is depicted. While the idea of releasing D-Class hasn't found much popularity on the wiki, there has been a growing sympathy around the way that D-Classes are approached. One of these canonical interpretations on the rise is that rather than killing D-Class at the end of the month, the Foundation wipes their memory and keeps them in containment. In turn, the way articles are approached by on-site writers continues to affect the way that off-site content creators portray canon.
In conclusion,
the development of online fan culture has ultimately sought to diminish the exclusivity between content creation and fan engagement. Because of the established dynamics between authorial accessibility, canonical certainty, and fandom separation, true inclusivity isn't likely within our modern literary conventions. The SCP fandom breaks these conventions by both re-examining how fans interact with media and medium, as well as re-examining how that media is created. Since anything could be canon, and anyone can make content, then everyone can determine canon. In a sense, the work itself is the fandom, and the community is a complex, self-sustaining, truly symbiotic ecosystem. On the wiki, writers create containment logs that inspire SCP tales. Those tales inspire people to make SCP games, which in turn inspire cinematic YouTube content. Then, ultimately, that YouTube content informs the perception of new writers on the wiki. Ultimately, the popularity of the fandom is a testament to its own accessibility. In part, this community is centered around a narrative story. In part, this community is centered around helping new writers develop skills. And in part, this community is centered around paranormal roleplay. But no matter the reason that people join the fandom, its existence illustrates the unique ways that fans can actively shape stories. While narratives like Homestuck toy with the concepts of reader interaction, their canons are ultimately subject to those of their creators. The SCP fandom demonstrates that not only are fans an integral part of media consumption, but when given the opportunity, fanon can be just as engaging as any canon.
There is a video atheist Illuminati on YouTube. Heed my warnings. I just want to be the next D'Angelo Wallace with the quality of ContraPoints and the content of 𝘂𝑦𝘅. The commentary channels are coming. Heed my warnings. The commentary channels are coming.